Cheers, Alex.
Cheers,
Got
my
my
friend.
Blue Run right here.
I'm
Great
on
to see you
gin.
again.
I thought we were instructed to have gin today. I
Oh,
thought
we're
I'm on
we're
the
gonna
gin.
get to that. We're gonna get to that. But I just, because we're so happy about Blue Run, I just always feel like
Yeah, Mary Beth, you're not in on this joke yet. I don't have any Blue Run yet, so Brian teases me every episode.
Now our loyal viewers, of which, by the way, there are many. Thank you so much for your response to our latest video. I think we almost immediately went into triple digits with it, so thank you. But our loyal viewers will note I'm a little bit dressed up today, a little bit, up in the game a little bit, because we have a very distinguished guest today, Alex. We have the Honorable Mary Beth Long, and those aren't just words. They were earned through 17 years as an intelligence and defense professional. She is and remains and will always remain, I guess, based on the nature of history, the first Senate-confirmed female Assistant Secretary of Defense of the United States.
Bravo.
And she also is an actual spy. As you know, I'm more of a poser. I was a Central Intelligence Agency officer for a long time, but I was kind of back at the dull end of the spear. Mary Beth, on the other hand, was out at the front of the spear. So before we're done, we will definitely be getting Mary Beth's take on James Bond. Who was the best James Bond? A little bit of a controversy in our show. Mary Beth, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. And you were so at the far end of the spear that the feathers looked like they were ahead of you.
Don't stop there. Keep roasting. This is great for me.
only because they actually were ahead of me. I'm put in mind of a line from some movie right behind me, huh, Lieutenant? So in any event, welcome, Mary Beth. Mary Beth has had a long and storied career with the U.S. government, and after her government service has been continuing to serve influentially as someone working with some of our best and most important allies. She's been a professor. She's really done it all. Mary Beth, tell us what your thoughts are. Oh, one thing I have to mention, along with her other great distinguished roles, Mary Beth served as the head of the group for NATO that was working on nuclear policy in the Bush administration. So I'm sure Mary Beth will have plenty of things to say about the Ukraine and Putin. But Mary Beth, why don't you talk to us for a minute? Tell us also what your cocktail of choice is for today.
Oh, my cocktail of choice was actually, it's slightly in the process of elimination. So since we were going to talk a little bit about NATO and Europe, et cetera, I normally go for a Pins Cup this time of year with a wonderful, wonderful wink, which is hard to find in the United States these days, and a good solid garden cucumber. But in deference to our French allies, we went with, in my particular case, the French 75, because I like mine with vodka. I know that apparently at least one of you goes with gin. And when I do gin, I've got to do Hendrix.
Fair enough. I too have chosen, and how's this for unusual? I've chosen French. I have a French gin. I am drinking G-Vine, which is a French gin made from grapes.
I didn't know the French made gin.
There you go.
It feels like that's a potential resumption of the war between France and the UK. That's
Entente cordiale demonstrated by my choice of cordial.
Do they make Pims?
So,
I love Pims. I do like Pims very much. I think with Pims, doesn't really matter. I would put vodka in Pims, actually. I think the taste of gin interferes a bit too much with Pims. But if I'm having a martini, definitely gin. There is no such thing as a vodka martini.
So I'm with Mary Beth on the right side of history. I have vodka in mine, and I love a good vodka martini, regardless of what Alex says. He's been unable to convert me with many attempts at gin over the years, but, we'll keep trying.
As long as it's not Russian vodka, because we all have to make.
Oh, you're on message.
Ma'am.
We did that already. We talked about the end of Russian vodka for us.
Good to know.
It's not much of a loss, to be honest.
Yeah, well, but we did drop a caveat, Mary Beth. You'll recognize that language as a lawyer. We are willing to drink Russian vodka if somebody can point us to, and listeners, you're still on the hook for this, a Russian vodka not made in Russia, but made by Russian expatriates in a good part of the world.
People who got out of Russia because they couldn't stand Putin. I'm all for those Russians. My objection isn't with the Russian people per se, it's with the regime. If there is someone out there making Russian vodka in protest at Putin, I will buy some.
Absolutely. We'll get cases on our way. Maybe Mary Beth, you can find us someone like that. I know your connections in the expat world are extensive.
I don't know anyone who's making Russian without being in the Russian territory vodka, but I will take that on as homework from this assignment.
Well, if
Well,
you
thank
can
you.
nail it, it'd be great because I get corrected on everything else. I mispronounce a Dutch name, we get feedback up the you wouldn't believe how much feedback. But when we did a call out for this, we did a call out for some Russian vodka, not from Russia. Birds chirping in the distance.
Crickets.
Crickets.
Alternatively, listeners, business opportunity for you. Somebody
that's
should go do that. I'm sure there's plenty of people who are in the diaspora who could do that. Now, before we get to Alex's great story today and Mary Beth's many stories, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, viewers of the podcast, through the magic of technology, Alex and I are in our home studios, and yet it's Sunday night. Tomorrow night, we're appearing live in New York. And so we're in New York right now. So figure out how we're doing that. Most importantly, tomorrow night, Monday, 6 June 2022, and Tuesday night, 7 June 2022, please join us at the amazing and haunted Von Bar in Manhattan's Bowery at 3 Bleecker Street. We will start at 6 p.m. both nights. There'll be bespoke cocktails. There'll be ghosts. There'll be ghost stories. There'll be the most amazing World War II escape story you've never heard. And as I've mentioned, and no one's guessed this yet, we will have a live guest who may or may not actually exist. And Mary Beth, if you have time to jump on the train, we'd love to see you.
Love it.
It's a live guest versus a dead guest, or
No clues.
no clues.
You gotta just maybe we'll do 20 questions at the end, but for now, no. We just leave it out there. It's a live person who will be interviewed by us, and that person may or may not actually exist.
Ooh, sounds
Give it some
thrilling.
thought.
Yeah.
Give it some thought. And while you think about that, Mary Beth, we've selected today one of my favorite stories from Alex's book, Lessons in History, now available in the United States at all good booksellers and on the interwebs. And it's the story, Mary Beth, you probably know this story, of the white mouse. And I picked this story because it kind of reminds me a little bit of you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Lessons from History. Here we go, chapter 35. Kiwi-born, Australia-bred, Nancy Wake was a free spirit from the word go. When she was 16, she ran away from home in Sydney to work as a nurse, and she came here to London to train as a journalist. Nancy Wake worked as a foreign correspondent in Paris and in Vienna, and she, of course, saw, therefore, the rise of the Nazis firsthand. When the Second World War broke out, Nancy Wake was living in Marseille, and she worked as an ambulance driver until France fell, when she joined the resistance. And her work was known to the Gestapo, but her skillfulness in avoiding them was second to none, hence being christened by the Gestapo the White Mouse. Things became harder for her once the Wehrmacht occupied Vichy France, and Wake's network was betrayed by a collaborator to the Germans. She escaped from France into Spain. She had married someone in the resistance in the course of the war, and her husband, who was part of her network, stayed behind in France to try and carry on their work, and he was killed by the Germans. She reached the UK, and she joined our Special Operations Executive, SOE. And
Sorry to interrupt you, Alex.
Yep.
Just to explain this again for our North American viewers, Mary Beth knows this well. SOE was the equivalent of the American Office of Strategic Services during World War II, which became the Central Intelligence Agency. Please proceed.
Correct. After training with SOE, she parachuted into Auvergne, and she was caught up in a tree in her descent. And famously, she was found dangling from its branches by the resistance who'd gone to collect her. One of the reasons that I decided to write about her is from this story, because apocryphally or not, the leader of the French who'd gone to collect these operatives parachuting in is said to have looked up into the tree and said, "I hope all French trees bring forth such beautiful fruit." And she, dangling from the tree, replied entirely understandably, "Don't give me that French shit." A great how do you do.
Also, that phrase should be worked into more daily conversations.
Well, at the risk of racial whatever, yes. And so SOE supplied, and famously, of course, SOE supplied weaponry and cash to the resistance networks. And so they were dropping this stuff off for distribution by Wake and her team. And she coordinated targets for Allied bombing and for Allied attacks in the run-up to D-Day. So it was vital work. Keen to show their ability to resist the Germans, as the resistance always wanted to be able to do directly, they overreached themselves. They moved from guerrilla fighting to full-blown combat, in which they were not suited to take on the Wehrmacht. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned. Wake proved herself every bit the equal of the men fighting alongside her. And in heavy fighting, they retreated over the course of 3 days, pitched battle. And she kept up in that battle, fighting the Germans. They almost didn't sleep. They're fighting on the run. And then when her group needed to tell London what was going on in order to explain why the pre-D-Day plans weren't being enacted, she volunteered to do a 300-mile round trip cycle to get to the nearest radio facility to report to London what was
bicycle
happening.
Yes,
correct. And she did that successfully. And in times of relaxation, by the way, she proved herself the equal of her colleagues by drinking them under the table. So she was a
cheers.
Cheers to the White Mouse. She was an all-rounder. I do love Givine. Great gin. Right. So then they were joined by some Yanks, some of your lot, and Wake's group undertook several assaults on German convoys and vehicles, and they successfully defended themselves from attack, including, so they were continuing distributing their material from airdrops and constant fighting against the Germans by this point. During one of these raids, she killed a German with her bare hands. This is not a woman who was messing around. Important to say that Wake's story is not without controversy in the history of the resistance. There were 3 women camp followers in the resistance group with them, and they were companions of the men. 2 of them, and they were being abused by the resistance fighters alongside Wake, she recalls. 2 of them she convinced the men to release. The 3rd, she conducted an ad hoc interrogation of, convinced herself that she was a spy for the Germans, ordered the resistance to kill her. They said no. She said, if you don't, I'll do it myself. And they said, all right, then we will. And they executed her. So no kind of fair trial. I mean, I know it was wartime, but still no kind of fair trial. It's not a straightforward story in that regard. Anyway, her group took part in further operations against the Germans after D-Day, with the Allies on the front foot and the Germans retreating, fighting alongside and sometimes ahead of the line and ahead of the soldiers, as the Allied invasion carried on into southern France. And many of her comrades died alongside her. They fell, but she survived. After the war, Nancy Wake remarried. She married an RAF and bomber pilot. She ran unsuccessfully for political office in Australia several times. And then after the death of her second husband, so she outlived another husband, she returned to the UK, and she was to be found on her regular bar stool at the Stafford Hotel, which is still there, well into her 90s, belting down gin and tonics and regaling people around her with her stories. Cheers for her gin and tonics.
And may we all be on such bar stools on our 99th birthday.
In our 90s.
Hopefully together.
Indeed. She died just shy of her 99th birthday, and her ashes were scattered upon the French hills upon which she had fought for freedom. That is the story of Nancy Wake, the White Mouse.
Well, that is an amazing story, as always. I always enjoy the little bit of extra twist that Lessons from History includes. Nancy Wake is a well-known story, but you definitely included some things that at least I didn't know. And I can't wait to get Mary Beth's expert professional commentary on that story. But I can't help but just pause for a second, Alex. If I understood your telling correctly, there came a sort of a decisive moment where Nancy Wake's unit all of a sudden became assisted by OSS and other Americans, and suddenly became much more successful. Am I hearing that right?
Your contribution was decisive here as it was in the rest of the war, John, if that's what you're seeking to elicit from me.
Well,
yes.
not mine, not mine, but the brave people of the United States. Mary Beth, yes. What are your thoughts?
Actually, 3 things jumped out at me. This is a well-known story, and I'd actually forgotten part of it. One of the things that really resonated with me, and your writing of it, was the first time I'd heard about her being young and being distinctive. And every woman I know in the intelligence services, particularly the case officers, you wouldn't be familiar with this, Brian, but the pointy end of the spear, those women, they're unusual. My parents used to say, Mary Beth marches to the beat of a different drummer. So I think we should have a toast to women who march to the beat of a different drummer.
2,025%, Mary Beth. I couldn't agree with you more.
Oh, Brian's disrespect for maths again.
I mean, I could agree with you more. I could agree with you 3,000%, but for now, we'll go with 2,025. Now, let me say this. as a rear echelon observer, although, you know, partly my rear
The
echelon was the
telescope in your case.
right, but part of it was observing from the White House. I'll just add that. However,
He never mentions it normally, Mary. You must be you bringing that out, Mary Beth. He never mentions that.
it is, in my opinion, indisputably true that some of our most successful case officers in CIA history, including Mary Beth, have been women. And part of the reason for that, I think, is, you know, backwards and on high heels or whatever Ginger Rogers said. But also, there are so many societies that maybe even to this day simply will not believe that a government would allow a woman to be in a position of such responsibility and authority that you slide under the radar. Right?
That is definitely true, although it's changing. You know, some of
Yeah.
I had two big areas of success. One of them was in the Middle East. And, you know, you cannot, it was unimaginable, particularly in those days, that a woman would be a spy, number one. But also, and even when I was in the Defense Department, one of my general friends said, it's not just that, it's now imaginable. We've seen the movies. But we so rarely get to engage women in the way in which women spies engage us. You're smart, you're funny, you're engaging, you know what we do, you're charming. And that is a huge plus that women have. But my very first tour that I was super successful on was a tour that I took because the supervisor said to me, well, you can't go there, because they won't allow a woman to recruit them. They're such a machismo country.
Right.
And of course, every woman I know, and I'm sure that Ms. Wake is the same way, she double, triple, quadruple down and beat at their own game.
Yeah.
Spot on.
And proved it. Yeah. No, I think that's a huge part of our history and our allies' history that needs to be told more. You are, Mary Beth, our second female guest on the podcast. No plan there, just the way it happened, although we're going to bump up our numbers tomorrow and Tuesday significantly. And our first female guest, Dr. Nicole Fisher-Roberts, talked a lot about, even in the 90s, how in academia at a university that shall not be named, but you would recognize, Mary Beth, there was still such a stereotyping of women that, for example, she was told not to wear mascara because she might not get her PhD if the men thought she was too flirty. I'm paraphrasing, Nicole. I know we'll be seeing you in New York. I screwed that up a little, but that's the gist of it. And without putting you too much on the spot, you've had many careers in areas that are traditionally men-centric. How have you experienced over the last 30 years the change, hopefully, in the way women are treated?
You know, when I joined CIA, there were no women in my particular class who were going to be case officers. Zero.
That's me. I mean spies, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, spies out, you know, out in the undercover, in the field. No women in my class were designated for that job, although 6 of us thought that's why we were there. And our male counterparts with almost the exact same backgrounds were slotted. So, you know, it was a problem. I think we've come a long way. I think we've got a long way to go. When I was at the Department of Defense, on track to be the first woman 4-star, I can.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Mary Beth.
Ahead.
Talk about the equivalency of stars to civilian ranks, because that's probably unknown to most people.
Oh, okay. So of course, I was from the policy civilian world. And of course, the joint staff or the military, uniform military parallels that world. And what we do is have equivalencies as to stars. And in those days, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, which puts you at about, in my era, about number 7 in the Pentagon, was a 4-star job. In fact, it was the first among equals of the 4-star ranking assistant secretaries.
So it would be like being a 4-star general or admiral.
4-star general, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
really the most senior rank that's not unusual. 5 stars are very unusual, right?
We don't have any 5 stars. We haven't had one since World War II.
Yeah.
Is it Eisenhower?
Also Bradley and Marshall, I think. Too.
I think I've seen Marshall. I think that was was the last. But there were some people with some real heartburn with that. You know, when I walked on base, they put the 4-star flag up, just like if I were a general or an admiral. but it took me 9 months, and every thought I had that we'd actually jumped the hurdles of women in these positions was disproven in that
Oh,
one.
really?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It was
just
brutal.
and just so our viewers and listeners understand, this may be a little counterintuitive, but Mary Beth was appointed by George W. Bush, not by one of the presidents considered to be more woke in today's parlance, and Bob Gates, right? Secretary of Defense.
Yep. Secretary of Defense Bob Gates was the one who said, I don't understand the opposition to you. You've been doing the job for over a year, and we're going to push this through. And they interviewed every man. I'm single, which also made it difficult. Every man I dated since the age of 23, because of course I'd been in CIA and they had the list. So here's to a, thank God, relatively short list.
Oh, I don't know what. Am I choosing that? Okay.
I think you mean in number, not stature, right, Mary Beth?
Well, yes, but in number. Thank goodness I spent a lot of time abroad.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, so what would you say were the main differences between sort of representing the government overseas as a CIA officer? Because a lot of the work was undercover, but I know some of it was also doing liaison work with our allies. And when you then jumped into the civilian policy world in the Bush administration, how did that change the way your life ran with our allies?
Well, it was a lot less fun. There is no job out there that's more fun than being a CIA case officer or an officer in the field.
Take that, FBI.
Yeah. Oh, please take that, DEA and FBI and NSA for that matter.
Yeah, all of them, all those other posers.
They are posers.
But you let MI6 into the club, right?
Well, in fact, one of my first jobs in DOD was helping the SAS build an elite unit in Afghanistan. Under my authorities, I was responsible for counter-narco-terrorism at the time. And it may or may not be the case that the Brits built a very specialized unit that was second to none in the region, frankly.
And we should say, I think, for historical perspective and for our many viewers who were not alive then, that in that time period, during the Clinton administration in the 90s, Cold War's over. Everyone foolishly thought, in my opinion, there was going to be a peace dividend and we didn't have to worry about Russia or China or, peace forever, right? And so our intelligence services, and I assume the British as well, were going through kind of growing pains on now what do we do? The Cold War's over. What do we do? And I was the lawyer, as you know, in charge of the Counter Narcotics Center, Crime and Narcotics Center. And that was it the word lawyer or counter narcotics that got you?
Yes.
All right, fair. fair. I can tell you right now, this is going to be Alex's favorite episode ever.
It's very great guest. We should book you every week.
But if I may return to my point, that was where the action was in those days, was the war on drugs, right? It was really before 9/11. It was after the Cold War, and those were priorities for our governments, right?
They were. Actually, when I think about the time that I dealt with you professionally as a lawyer in CIA was the hot tub episode. But I'm just going to leave that marker down for you guys to follow up later on in your conversations. It'll be one of those mystery conversations.
You might have to say that again. I'm not sure our audience will hear you.
Hot tub. There was a hot tub involved.
Yes.
I heard it.
I heard about it weeks afterwards. That's
there isn't enough bleach in the world for my eyes right now.
Obviously, that's a code word for a highly sensitive operation.
Yeah, it must be. Well, I hope so.
Yeah, we call our compartmented
Cheers.
built-ins different things. But no, I mean, both the Brits, well, actually the Brits in the US in particular, French, not so much. The French had turned their attention somewhat to economic espionage, as I recall, believe it or not, helping out there.
No, I do believe that. Yeah.
Yep. And,
hey, let me just sorry to interrupt, but this is a really important thing that we've stumbled onto here. I believe no, that is something we will not stumble into again. The United States intelligence services, I'm not sure if this is true for the UK, I think it is. Essentially, we don't do economic espionage in the sense that certainly we collect economic data and technology data, but we don't then turn around and use it to prioritize the economic benefit of our companies. And most other intelligence services in the world, I'm not sure about the UK, do. And you're talking about the French. It wasn't just that they were stealing information for national security reasons. They wanted to benefit their companies, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I don't think the UK's ever done it. I mean,
I wasn't sure. Good clarification.
I'm not aware. I mean, the UK, of course, is the originating of gentlemen don't read gentlemen's mail. And I think there is a line there. But not only were they stealing, but they were systematically assessing and gathering information on negotiating positions so that they could beat U.S. deals, particularly in the defense and high-tech industry, as nascent as the latter was in those days.
Right. Corporate negotiations, not just negotiations between countries for trade and things like that. Yeah. And that's just an important distinction, because I run into people all the time, particularly in Europe in the post-Snowden era, who say, post-Snowden era, who say, look, all you guys want to do is spy on everybody so you can advantage your technology companies, you can steal people's oil, and you can, become an economic empire. And that's pretty strictly prohibited for us.
True. I actually would argue that if I were queen of the universe for a day, that I would maybe reconsider parts of that. Our economic stability and our economic prowess, particularly in the tech sector, is now so closely interrelated and interconnected, I believe, with our national security, that perhaps we're living in antiquated times of these distinctions without a difference that in fact do have a difference. But that's a different podcast, perhaps.
Right. And
it's fascinating though. And I really appreciate your insights on it. I'm careful with my remarks too, but I think in my time as a consultant, I've seen a little bit of that about other countries and their commercial or corporate activities, as much on the bungs and greasing the wheel side as much as on the espionage side. But you definitely in big corporate environments find that some countries are inclined towards that. Enough to drive me to drink. I've had a top up. So cheers.
Well, Alex will know what I'm referencing. I think I've been involved with some analyses of startup companies going into potential other countries, in which we looked at it and we decided there is absolutely no way to do business in country X without bribery. So we didn't go. But not every company is like that.
No. Well, and also there are so many small, hungry companies out there that could, even if they could navigate it, it would be a very short run for them, because the disappearance of your intellectual property and the fact that you're going to get duplicated and run out of the market. We had a serious problem, frankly, with our allies. Drink to the Israelis.
Absolutely.
Well, wait, hang on. Let's hear what she's going to say.
I don't need to. I was invited to drink to the Israelis.
All right.
Sliver of democracy in the Middle East.
Okay.
Our friends.
Done.
Our friends, but from a hang on to your technology and your underwear with both hands, they can be a difficult industrial/corporate challenge in making sure that you have any longevity in the market. We'll leave it like that.
Yeah. They're corporate frenemies a lot of times. If I would take the parlance of the crazy kids from like 20 years ago, but fair enough.
I suppose if your business culture grows up in an environment in which you are beset on all sides, people who think you shouldn't exist, you take a different position. I'm not justifying any of this. I'm just saying that you can see how our culture grows, that it says, us first. And it may not be for the long term when you need business relationships to be trustworthy on a generational scale. But, if you're being brought up to think in the very short term, how do we get the next step?
Yeah, it's existential. It's existential for your country sometimes. I'm actually happy to be visiting Israel for the first time later this year, so I'm very excited.
You've never been? Oh, it's a great country.
Never
Wonderful.
been. As you know,
I love it.
Wonderful
you're gonna love
people, amazing people, amazing leaders.
I'm really looking forward to it.
You got to go to Jerusalem. Skip Tel Aviv, except for partying.
Okay. All right. I'll have to get a detailed itinerary from you at a later time. So look, we could talk to you all day long, probably part of tomorrow too. But I want to get to the Ukraine and Putin, because I don't know of anyone really who has the combination of skill set, experience, and insights that you have. We've talked a lot about it on this podcast, partly in terms of Alex and I are buddies. We laugh a lot. We drink a lot. We started this podcast as kind of a lighthearted thing, but we always planned on tying all of our stories to current events. And all of a sudden, here we are in the middle of this, I think, and I think Alex thinks, decisive moment for the 21st century. And so we want to give our viewers insights that maybe they can't get anywhere else. So I guess on a scale of 0 to 10, Mary Beth, what's the chances that we are not in a nuclear war by December?
That we're not in a nuclear war?
Phrase it any way you want. How dangerous a moment are we in?
I think we're in probably the most dangerous moment that we've had post World War II, maybe post 1950s with the Cuban Missile Crisis would be up in there.
I agree. I think it's much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I think, and this is going to be a Debbie Downer because this has been so much fun, but I think we're in a bad place in that you see the shift in momentum right now, particularly in the East, being much more Russian advancement. We've got summer coming, so we've got dry weather, and what they need to do is in defending themselves is going to be easier than them being on the offensive.
Right.
I think the West, as united and coalesced as the West is, it's not going to last. We already see cracks.
Yeah. And let me just say, sorry to interrupt you. Let me just say, for future viewers, we're recording this in early June of 2022, when, as I recall, in the last couple of days, the Germans and the French have, in my opinion, maybe Alex will differ with me, predictably started to talk about how really it's time to negotiate and Zelensky needs to give some territory. And I was terrified this moment would come, and now it's here.
I don't disagree with that. And I think it was, there's a reason that Finlandization is a term used in international relations where our colleagues and friends in Finland were forced to surrender about 10% of their country to appease Russia. I also agree with what you guys were saying about this probably being the most dangerous time, certainly in my lifetime. But since 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the book, I tell the story of how a bear nearly started a nuclear war.
And we've told that on our show.
Yeah, tensions were running very high in 62. And I think that in that regard, things were exceptionally dangerous for humanity. But I think it's almost a distinction without a difference. To try and argue between these 2 points, near existential danger and near existential danger. I mean, the Russians have, as people point out, but I don't think quite appreciate what it means, the Russians have the use of tactical nuclear weapons in their order of battle.
Yeah,
nobody else does.
They don't see it as a distinction. Mary Beth will correct me if I'm wrong. They don't lose conventional wars. If they're about to lose a conventional war, they move to nuclear. And I would also, let's just put a fine point on this, Mary Beth. So what Alex is getting to, and what the two stories we told earlier, and I implore all of our viewers to go on YouTube and find these, is the hair trigger problem. Right. That everyone's on a hair trigger. Someone's going to make a mistake, like a bear is going to climb over your fence. So talk about that, but also talk about, do you believe Putin, without making a mistake, is likely to rationally, in his mind, decide to use tactical nuclear weapons as a strategy? You do, yeah.
I do. I have to put a plug in, by the way, your story on the missile crisis. So Mr. Cunningham sent me some things and I listened to some of your podcasts. If you listen to another podcast, it is amazing. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers. And I think actually we did a pretty nice job of predicting what was going to happen, unfortunately.
But I do think, look, there's two things. Number one, and your last question, I think, really drills down on it. I do think Putin will choose. He's already demonstrated that he will devastate an area so that no one can have it. If he can't have it, no one can have it. Mariupol is one of them. I think Donbass and some of those regions are going to be others. So the fastest way to do that, particularly given all his logistics and other problems, is a quote unquote tactical nuke, which will be basically a frontier between whatever the Ukraine gets to keep, assuming they get to keep anything, and the territories that he's carved out. So I absolutely see him doing it. And of course, doing it because he doesn't lose ground wars, he doesn't lose tactical wars, and he can't afford to come home with anything less than a success.
So now that we're all horrified, what is End Day +1? So he launches a tactical nuclear weapon from, Western Russia, Eastern Ukraine. presumably the Allies, our side, has the ability to use massive conventional force to destroy whatever launched that nuclear tactical, so-called tactical nuclear weapon. But now we're in World War III, right? So, I mean, my view is, just to be transparent in case our viewers haven't figured it out, we're going to be in World War III anyway. So we better figure out a way to deter the Russians as quickly as we can in the event that horrible thing happens. But what do we do in that situation? If you're in your old job, what do you recommend?
Well, two things. Stop thinking like that, because all of our Chinese friends who are listening, ni hao, that is what everyone is counting on. And the fact that we won't intentionally start World War III, and that our leadership, in particularly now, and the UK's and others, will never make that decision consciously. I think what it's doing is missing the middle ground, just things we can be doing now, but also things that we can be doing in lieu of a massive retaliation. And I think developing those further, there are a lot of things we can do now in the Black Sea, for example, that'll have the additional benefit of moving grain and other supplies, both out of the Ukraine to mitigate what I believe will be a world impacted food crisis. And certainly, as we're looking at the summer before fall, a fuel crisis, at least for the Europeans. And I'll leave it general like that. How's that? Without tipping our hands per se. Put me in charge.
Well, let's look. Hey, cheers to that. If I could wave a magic wand, I would do it. But let's unpack that. So, are you saying stop thinking about a massive retaliation? Or are you saying stop worrying so much? Well, let me just stop. Full stop. My view is our government is too worried about what we might do to provoke Vladimir Putin, and he needs to start worrying about what he could do to provoke us. So, if you agree, as it sounds like you do. I hate to even ask because I don't want to telegraph anything, but we could, let me put it like this. The West proposed, Alex is a former debater, proposed, the West could not sit by passively if Vladimir Putin uses a nuclear weapon. So do you agree or disagree?
Agree.
Okay. So if you agree, then there's a whole range of responses. I assume we would not say, we would respond in kind with a tactical nuclear weapon. I think that's my view. That's too much. But wouldn't we at least try to disable the capability on the battlefield to use that weapon again, even at the risk of escalating with Putin? Wouldn't we have to do that?
No, I don't think. Well, certainly we could disable the possibility or probability of the use of that weapon on the battlefield. But I think there are other ways that you could deter Putin or anyone following up with a similar kind of activity. And that would be broadening one's perspective of what Putin or Russians hold most dear. And attacking those, maybe in a physically distinct location. It could be
the Arctic.
Yep. Don't forget, we have, we're all talking about physical space. There's space, there's cyberspace. There are a lot of other places. And to telegraph that we're willing to retaliate. And secondly, that we have options and scaled retaliation in kind. Third, that retaliation doesn't necessarily lead one to World War III, certainly eventually, but there are lots of options on the table. And fourth, that they're willing to use them, I think is critical.
Yeah, and my own personal view is we're not sending the right signals right now.
No.
We're certainly not sending the right signals here in late May, early June of 2022 by saying we are taking off the table rocket systems that hit Russia, which are ridiculous, right? Like a hand grenade could hit Russia if you're throwing it from the border.
If you live in Alaska, where
I can see it from my house.
You're the governor, yes, you can practically, if you have a good baseball arm, you could throw a grenade into Russia.
Yeah, that strikes me. And look, I'll be transparent. I never voted for Trump. I worked for the Biden campaign. I don't love Biden, but I did it because I didn't want Trump to have another term. But we're botched, right? Like our signal sending is terrible right now, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think we need to look to the UK.
Yeah, Alex, what are you guys doing? Come on.
Say, Alex, what are you guys up to?
I think our record is pretty strong, and
it is. It is.
I compare ourselves to, I know you guys are kidding around, but the German record on this is really questionable. They've really let themselves down. First of all, very late and equivocal on their position, then promising support, which they've largely not delivered. We were flying aid material to Ukraine around German airspace. Now, in the medium term, it may be that the volte-face that the Germans, mixing my language, that the Germans have performed with regard to their commitment to defense policy is going to redefine the European position in the military. But right now, they're well behind the curve. And of course, they're the most important country in the EU for some of this decision-making process, notwithstanding the fact the only serious military in the European Union is the French and kind of half the Italians, of course.
Well, you're not in.
We're not in the EU, but
right.
That's part of why Britain's continued cooperation with European powers post-Brexit is important, because we're one of the leading European defence partners. But I suppose the other point, I was listening with real interest to your discussion about what happens in Ukraine. I'm really annoyed. I can't remember who said this, but I was reading somebody's analysis this week that said Putin's basically now worked out how he can win, which is to utterly destroy one square on the board and then move on to the next one. And if the Ukrainians are smart enough not to dig in, but are flexible, then they can avoid that predictable rolling destruction. And they drew the comparison with the British, being in the trenches and the final breakthrough that we had, enormous mines underneath German lines in the First World War, and blew up a series of mines in these tunnels and killed a bunch of Germans and advanced about 3 miles. And if that had been the tactic that we'd continued with, we might have made it to Berlin in the 1980s during the First World War. So there are limits to the total destruction and then advance position. And even if there aren't limits morally, there are limits in capacity, material, international patience and willingness to allow it to happen, and so forth. And so, from that perspective, I think the Putin position is destined to fail. I certainly hope that it is. But Britain has been pretty robust, to my mind, throughout this process. I just hope that we continue to be so, and we don't allow ourselves to be talked into an, inverted commas, more emollient position because many around us want to get back to business as usual. My instinct is we won't, but there's a lot of pressure on. And one of the things about Britain post-Brexit is that there's a lot of politicians who want to be seen as mainstream. And when I say mainstream, they want Britain to be seen as a mainstream European country still, and not too ultra and not too frontier and not too close to the Americans and so forth. Right. And one way might be to be, let's just be reasonable and realize Putin's got to have something before he can back down. And I give that no shrift at all, but I can see the pressure.
Yeah, so I'm going to make an invitation to Mary Beth on the air here. But the first thing they teach you in law school is don't ask a question that you don't know the answer to. But I'm planning on writing an essay that's going to be called "The Silence of the Doves." And this is about the last 30 years of the foreign policy establishment in which we both served, essentially assuming that peace is broken out and we don't have to worry anymore. And to point by point rebutting that, and putting out a call to arms that's not literally arms, that says, what happened to being realistic about what's happening in the world? The fact that we decide to retreat from Afghanistan doesn't mean that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and ISIS are retreating. We don't get to pick when we end wars. Not to get on my high horse. But Mary Beth, I'm hoping you'll co-author this with me.
I'll accept. And to Alex's point, I know we were joking around, but I'm headed actually to Turkey at the end of the week via Oxford. And
oh God, no. Oh God, no. You mean Cambridge, right?
Sorry, I know the real school, Oxford.
All right, now we're even. It's my favorite episode also.
But the British.
Oh, hang on. Okay, Alex is back.
I did it on purpose. I turned off my video. I'm not talking to someone who says that about Oxford.
All right, that's a good gag that we missed it. We all missed it. We thought it was a technical malfunction.
I saw it disappear, but I didn't realize it was from fear.
We're definitely keeping that in.
Alex is from that other trade school in the UK.
But it's not other. I mean, Oxford's a complete dump. There's a proper university in my country, and you're not visiting it. But anyway.
So you're on your way to Turkey. Please proceed.
On my way to Turkey via, and one of the things that will come up is the where we would be had the UK not stepped up and had it not been the steady hand on the tiller. I am not optimistic, Alex, about Germany following through. It certainly hasn't, and it's looking for ways to back down. God bless the French and Macron, but he's going in the wrong direction. And if it weren't for, let's hear it for the British carrying the load, and let's be honest, not getting much help from American domestic politics.
Not right now.
Or leadership.
Not right now. It's not good.
Let's be fair. Let's be fair the other way. Our domestic politics aren't helping either. We're constantly distracted by Prime Minister being ambushed by cake and Partygate and whatever you think about the issues in number 10. When you think about the significance of what's happening in Ukraine, these are very unwelcome distractions. So,
and by
what's
the
happening
way,
in American domestic politics is not unique.
No, and by the way, again, we could talk for hours with Mary Beth, but the short attention span of the Western voter is exactly what Vladimir Putin is counting on.
And China.
And China, all of our adversaries. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we now, like, there was a time a month ago when every day there was an update on all the major networks of what was happening in Ukraine. Now it's wall to wall Texas shooting, which is terrible. I mean, not to minimize it and not to get us into domestic politics, but he is counting on us losing our attention span, and we're doing it.
Oh, and if that's his bet, he's going to win it, because
he is.
So one of my gigs is reviewing the newspapers, late night TV in the UK. If you're lucky enough to tune in
every Sunday night.
I didn't know they had late night TV in the UK. I thought you guys all went to bed.
No, we sing "God Save the Queen" at 10 o'clock, and then they all switch off.
The static.
Yeah. Also, we have the Wheel and Fire. Anyway, so I do this gig, and which means that I look at all the papers, whether I agree with them or not. And my point is that my last outing on Friday, a couple of Fridays ago, there was no Ukraine on any of the front pages in the British news, except one nib. And that's what we took to put it into the reel and to talk about what was happening in Ukraine. But our attention is very short, and people get accustomed to things, and they become inured to things, and they are willing to overlook terrible human suffering if it's not, inverted commas, news anymore.
Thank God that we signed into law in the United States the $40 billion package for Ukraine before the school shooting, which again, terrible, horrible. I mean, we're distracted now. Like, our eye is off the ball, isn't it, MB?
It is, and I fault leadership. I mean, people have to know that you have to be able to walk and chew gum, is my fault.
At the same time. Yeah.
And we have become a culture of amnesia, short-term amnesia, I believe. And part of that is our just the way we treat ourselves with consumerism and social media, but it's sacrificing our security, and it's a shame.
You're right. I want to say two. I'm conscious of time, but I want to say two things. Given what you just said, first about the walk and chew gum. At the same time, as I thought Gerald Ford was a greatly underestimated president in your country, and he was the person accused of not being able to walk and chew gum.
Right.
And the second thing I wanted to say was that your point about leadership and gun control, and I don't believe that is an issue that in your country. Obviously, it's fallen on partisan lines, but it's not necessarily. I'm a conservative. It's not necessarily an issue for conservatives to take the position that's expected to be. One of my great heroes in life is John Howard, former Prime Minister in Australia, who after the Port Arthur massacre in that country, some 35 dead, 20 plus injured, instituted enormous controls on firearms in Australia, which was a country that had a lot of guns. They forbid any more sales of automatic weapons and of pump action weapons, and in 2 rounds of government buybacks they took more than 1 million weapons. In Australia, it's not that big a population, more than 1 million weapons out of circulation. It can be done, but the reason I mention it about leadership is that Howard said it's the 25th anniversary of that massacre recently, and Howard said, who's still with us, a great example of conservative leadership, and he looked back on it, he was invited to reflect, and he said, I took the view that if I couldn't do something about this, then I wasn't up to the job. And I think that's the kind of leadership that you need in order to get this kind of issue resolved.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I would wonder what Australian lobbying laws are, though, because if you can't stop the hundreds of millions of dollars of flowing into the coffers of politicians, it would be great if they would do the right thing anyway. And I'm not even sure what the right thing is, to be honest. That's not my area, but the money is overwhelming.
Oh, sure, but I mean, look, Australia. He was in a governing coalition with a national party that represented almost exclusively rural districts. Australia was at that time a great deal more rural in its population than it is now. There's been more of a migration to the cities, but
Right.
rural electorates have always wielded significant power. The rural electorates had a lot of guns in them, and if you think about, in buybacks alone, more than 1 million guns coming out of circulation,
Yeah.
it means there were an awful lot of guns in circulation. The
Yeah.
population at that time,
Yeah,
about
yeah.
25 million. So, it was no mean feat, and there would have been a significant lobby for it, but it can still be done.
Yeah, fair. So, Mary Beth, you're on your way to Turkey. What do you think the odds are as we speak here in late May, early June 2022 that Turkey will withdraw its objection to Sweden and Norway joining NATO?
It's always difficult to predict Erdogan, who in many respects has stepped up in incredible ways, and in others has all the cards, as he usually does, particularly
Right.
vis-a-vis his European partners. I think I'm optimistic. We could certainly use Turkish help by opening the Black Sea and getting grain out,
Grain
into
out.
the
Mhm.
humanitarian corridors. And frankly, I'm just going to put it on the table. If I were Erdogan, and I'm sure he's not listening and he's thought of it already, there's some F-35s that Lockheed Martin desperately needs to sell.
Yep.
And they've got an F-16 line that remains open, but very few buyers. And I'm hoping there's some creative thinking to make this worth Turkey's while. Maybe a little bit of finesse on PKK issues in northern Iraq, and we ought to be able to get going.
Yeah,
But
if I were a betting man, which I am,
Mhm.
I would say that right now Erdogan is Joe Manchin. He is waiting for his payoff to get his vote. And by the way, it sounds like I'm being pejorative. I'm not. More power to him. Like, this is one of the rare times.
I'm going
when
to be
he's
pejorative.
Well, do it.
I'm going to.
Do
So
it.
I think he is waiting for his payoff. He's making an objection to try and get that payoff. But I mean,
Yeah.
if the payoff is money, that's one thing, and that's kind of politics. The payoff may be you turn a blind eye while I pace the Kurds, and that's
I'm
going to
with
be
you.
bad.
I'm with you. Look, I was with you in 2000. Sorry, God, I'm blanking my decades. I was with you in 1992 when George H.W. Bush, who, as a general rule, I really admire, walked away from the Kurds. I'm totally with you on that. I'm just saying hopefully we can find a package of incentives that will not unduly damage our allies, but will get him on board. I'm optimistic about it.
I hear you. Look, we've been in hock for the use of Incirlik Airport, one of the few decent, really powerful, decent runways and great military bases. And you fly a lot of sorties out of Incirlik, and maybe Britain does, maybe Britain doesn't. But it's a very important place for the Allies. But there are limits, and we've got to find a way of getting the green light from Erdogan, but without letting him have
compromising everything. I agree. I totally agree. Now, so Mary Beth,
Yeah.
again, we could go on for 3 more hours, but I have to, before we sign off, I have to get your view on possibly the most existential question of our time, which our viewers will have anticipated by now. But best Bond, Mary Beth Long.
It depends on what you're looking for.
You scaredy cat. Just
Hang
fucking
on,
give your view.
I'm going to put my marker down.
Do it.
Sean Connery.
Amen. Amen, sister.
Only because I grew up with Sean Connery and used to lie in bed with my dad and watch Sean Connery, and so there's a lot of emotion.
Well, you were obviously watching reruns because you're far too young to have grown up with Sean Connery.
Now,
but secondly, thank goodness this isn't a democracy.
yes, acting wise, Daniel Craig.
This is getting worse. This is getting worse. And we're out of time. Jeremy, our producer, pull the plug.
I might
nail crooked pieces of wood across the windows.
I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that Alex likes George Lazenby better than he likes Daniel Craig. Am I right?
That's not possible.
That is definitely possible. The Lazenby outing on Her Majesty's Secret Service is not actually a bad film. They do a couple of weird things where they have jump scenes, cut scenes in the fights, which plainly didn't really work. But he's a much better Bond than Daniel Craig.
Oh,
Well, who's your favorite, Alex, from the
Roger Moore. Roger Moore, obviously.
Okay.
Roger
for
Moore is the best
entertainment
Bond.
Purposes, Roger Moore.
There you go.
ask
See?
him who. Hold on. Ask him who his second favorite is.
Why does he not have to?
You can't say Pierce Brosnan.
No, Timothy Dalton.
Worse.
Timothy Dalton. There you go.
You know what they call that? They call that the
Cognitive
silence.
dissonance.
Yes,
can
it's
you
like
possibly?
Mic drop. I'm not dropping my actual mic. It costs too much.
How can you possibly?
Dalton.
How can you possibly vote?
Only a Brit would say that.
How can you do it? It's not possible.
Only a British person, the country that produced James Bond, might take that view. I accept this.
Also, listeners, check out the Techtopia podcast by Chitra Raghavan, where Alex and I were guests talking about the technology and the history and how we go forward in the future. It's going to drop. I got to start over. Also, listeners, check out Alex and I on Chitra Raghavan's great podcast, Techtopia, which dropped last Thursday. And we talk about UFOs. We talk about technology. We talk about how podcasts could be the first draft of history. It's going to be fun. Check it out. Well, you know what? We could talk to Mary Beth forever, and
it's been great, Mary Beth.
We will in
Thank
the future.
you. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Tell a spy story. Woo!
Next time.
Next time.